All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first conference of 2024, the Coming Automotive Supply Chain, Sustainable and Profitable. This is going to be a two-parter in terms of the conferences that we'll be doing the first two of this year, both on automotive supply chain. First one on sustainability and profitability. Second one on globalization at the crossroads, looking at nearshoring and reshoring. So today we're focusing on sustainability and if and how we can make that more profitable. Let me do a little bit of intro about the Automotive Futures Group, conference logistics, and then little intro to the coming automotive supply chain. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the managing director of the Automotive Futures Group here in Ann Arbor. I'm retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. Our funding for the Automotive Futures Group comes from our affiliate program, our research, and our conferences, and primarily comes from our affiliate members. And we can't go on without thanking them and thanking them enough, because we could not do what we do without them. We've got a lot of benefits to becoming an affiliate, but one of the new things we want to announce for this year is a 20% discount for classes of the U of M Executive Education Program at the Ross School of Business. They're digital and open enrollment programs. This is just something that's going to be starting out, and I think Stuart's going to be talking about this, the Sustainability Leadership Program that's going to start in, I think, April or March or April. But the other classes that are going on through the open enrollment program, there'll be a 20% discount for all our affiliate members. Our research partners that we've been working with for the last 20 to 30 years, that across IT organization, OEMs, government, NGO, suppliers, and consultants. And from our research and conferences for 2024, we're going to do our powertrain strategies for the 21st century project, that survey that will be going out in the late spring. And the conference will be the future of charging. We'll be continuing our research on EV evolutions, following what's going on in EVs in China, the US, and the EU. And our Future of Automotive IT conference in September, we're going to be looking at AI in the auto industry again. We did this last year, and as you know, things are just moving along very quickly here, and we're going to continue that discussion. Today, as I said, we're doing a coming automotive supply chain, and I think one could argue, why is it coming? And it's coming because it's changing so dramatically. And finally, our conference, our 17th annual Inside China conference, that's going to be starting that will be in November. Automotive Futures primarily made up about student researchers, but we do have two major researchers. One, Kara Elkire, who's on the YouTube video right now, collecting comments and questions and feeding them into us here. And Sherry Netler, who's our research assistant. And also subbing today, Donna Sell for Sherry. Our LinkedIn page is something that we've been focusing on for the last couple of years. And we encourage all of you to reach out and connect and follow our LinkedIn page. We're posting 2 to 3 times a week. Upcoming conferences, as I said, the April conference is Globalization at the Crossroads, and July 17th is going to be the propulsion strategies for the 21st century, EV charging. That'll be our 16th annual conference logistics. So we've got a really good set of speakers today. Stuart Hart from the U of M's Urban Institute for Global Sustainability Enterprise is going to be kicking it off for us. He'll be looking more more generally at sustainability and its effect on companies. Stuart's been following this since the 90s, so this is something that he's been passionate about for a long time. Fred Gersdorf from General Motors is going to be talking about kind of an OEM perspective of the supply chain. Dave Andrea and Lori Hoos, both from Plant Moran, are going to be talking about it about the sustainability more from a supplier perspective and some of the challenges that suppliers are facing when they're dealing with sustainability. I'm going to start out, as I said, Stuart, then we'll do a 10-minute Q&A, then Fred, a 10-minute Q&A. We're going to break at around 10:50, and then we'll come back and finish with Lori and David before we adjourn for lunch at around noon. Post-conference, all the attendees will get linked to the presentations and the video. Affiliates get the presentations, but also to get a review summary of the highlights from the conference that Kara will be working on. The agenda, speaker bios, registration list, sponsorship opportunities, affiliate information, upcoming events, all on the coming automotive supply chain website that was sent to you with your live stream and your information for the conference earlier. If you don't have it, let us know. Audience questions and feedback. We've got Google Forms that are well, they're probably not set up because we had to switch the live stream system. So I think the best way for you people who are online is to enter questions into the chat section of the live stream, and Kara will send those to us, and then we'll be asking the questions from there. Here in the audience, so we've got people here in the audience. They'll be we've got question cards on your tables. We'll be circling around picking up those questions, so feel free to ask questions after each speaker. Okay, when you look at the coming supply chain, when we look at sustainability, when in terms from the federal government perspective, there's no real regulations, but companies are preparing for potential sustainability regulations through the SEC. And here you're looking at that potential for requiring registrants to provide certain climate-related information in their registration statements and annual reports. Many companies are doing this already, just kind of in anticipation of this. Also, I think Dave and Lori are going to be talking about some of the California rules that are in play here. But when it comes to the globalization at the crossroads story, again, when you look at pre-2018, we have low-cost country purchasing. We've got then 2018 to 2020 tariffs on China and COVID with massive supply chain disruptions. 2021 to 2023 regulations and legislation, nearshoring benefits, low tariffs, and lower freight costs. And then post 2023 local ecosystem for raw materials and components. This is what we'll be talking about in our April conference. But so what it comes down to is why sustainability important? Why are we even talking about this? Well, it's important because it's what it ensures that we meet the needs of the present while without compromising the ability to meet the needs in the future. No small feat for any company and any industry. When you look at from the auto industry perspective, we're looking at the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions story. When you're looking at emissions related to sustainability, we'll be talking, other people are going to be talking about this as well, but just wanted to give you a heads up that there's the differences between the different scopes, the direct, the indirect, and the indirect related to upstream and downstream opportunities. Some of the major challenges for sustainability: regulatory compliance when needed. Tier 1 suppliers report that each of their automotive manufacturers they supply will usually ask for their own sustainability questionnaire to be filled out. Also, kind of a lack of awareness where suppliers may lack awareness or understanding of how to track the said metrics, and there may even be significant differences up and down the supply chain on how and what metrics are tracked. And finally, confusion surrounds the tracking of scope 3 emissions. Less than half of the automotive suppliers examined in a recent study gave details on plans to reduce scope 3 emissions. And when scope 3 is the upstream, which would be employee travel, purchased goods and services, transportation, distribution, fuel and energy related activities. For downstream, it's the use, processing, and end of life of sold products. And in the auto industry, that's the cars and trucks and distribution and transportation as well. From the profitability perspective, one of the areas that some of the researchers in the past have looked at in terms of implementing sustainable practices, companies can be signaling, conveying to consumers that they have developed high quality products when compared to their competitors, and then they believe that if they're employing sustainability practices, they're likely to have better product quality. Also, in a study with 132 automotive companies from 13 countries utilizing corporate social responsibility, which would probably be sustainability would be underneath that scores, it was found that CSR was positively and significantly related to corporate financial performance. I'm sure that Stuart will be talking about that as well. Another case for exports. In a study involving medium and large-sized Brazilian exporters representing more than 90% of Brazilian exports, they found that sustainability improves a firm's reputation to be able to negotiate more favorable contracts, increase perceived value by customers, promotes customer company identification, may also engage companies to further understand consumer needs. And this is likely to improve and streamline processes, avoiding waste and pollution. Now, when you look at some of the sustainable processes that are out there, we're just looking at a few companies and some of the things that they're doing. You look at BMW and their supplier Draxelmeyer, looking at putting natural fibers in their car interiors. We're looking at IAC company, a major supplier, looking at a fiber frame, fiber products replacing the sheet metal, which is a huge deal in some of their vehicles, with a 50% possible rate reduction. In terms of steel, something that's been going on, probably for decades with reusing steel. Recycling steel has been something going along for a while, but in 2022, GM had in their sustainability reports said that their supply that U.S. Steel is resupplying GM with steel is made of 75% fewer emissions. So not only is it just recycling steel, you're looking at fewer emissions. And Volkswagen, working with Scania, is looking at something called H2 green steel, and with the idea of reducing emissions by up to 95%. For aluminum, you're definitely looking at areas for recycling aluminum, but using less energy to do that. So they're also looking at low carbon prices, not higher than 20% of commercial prices for aluminum. This is at GM's U.S., Canadian, and Mexico facilities. And Ford is also using a closed loop recycling system to maximize its plant's ability to recycle aluminum. So it's recycling as part of the story, but it's also the emissions that come out of that. And finally, looking at, you can't talk today without talking about batteries. It's an energy intensive process, emits considerable amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So some of the companies are working, I think all of the companies are trying to find ways of doing this more efficiently. BMW is researching energy efficient resource methods for the production of battery cells. As of September 23, they had a sample production of 6th generation round cells, and that those cells have 20% higher density, but also a reduced CO2 footprint in production by up to 60%. And VW doing similar things, but looking at solid state batteries. And here you're looking at the development of solid state batteries with their partner, QuantumScape. And they've been working on this for quite a while. And I think every battery company in the world is working on this, as well as every R&D company in the world is trying to do this. But they're trying to do this from as for a sustainability perspective as well. So that's all I wanted to say to start off the story here. And I think now we'll turn it over to Stuart for him to share his slides and tell the story. Stuart, I could tell you this is the story of your academic life, is sustainability. Thank you. Welcome. Stuart Hart is the professor of residence at the University of Michigan's Erb Institute for Global Sustainability Enterprise. He was the founder of the Erb Institute's dual master's program in the early 1990s, and then went on to hold faculty positions and launch centers for sustainable business at the University of North Carolina, Cornell University, and University of Vermont. He's one of the world's top authorities on the implications of environment and poverty for business strategy. His best-selling book, Capitalism at the Crossroads, published back in 2005, was selected by Cambridge University as one of the top 50 books on sustainability of all time. And the third edition of the book was published in 2010. His forthcoming book, Beyond Shareholder Primacy, Remaking Capitalism for a Sustainable Future, will be published by Stanford Business Books in April of this year. Welcome, Stuart.
Bruce, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think as Bruce has indicated, what I'd like to do today is perhaps provide a broader overview of how to think about sustainability broadly in business and strategy terms, not just the supply chain, but really the kind of the whole value chain and the overall sort of strategy for the firm. And in particular, to talk about, how do we convert the societal challenges, the social and environmental challenges associated with sustainability into actual business strategies. I'm a strategy professor, so I think in those terms. So that's what I'd like to do, spend a little bit of time, kind of a framework to enable you to think about this in those broad terms. But let me start with an admission. And the admission is, let's face it, sustainability is a buzzword. That the whole notion, the whole term sustainability means so many different things to different people, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but it's common for me to get into conversations with people. Seems like, about sustainability, seems like it's going well for the first minute or so, and then you realize they're talking about something completely different from me. You probably had a similar experience, that this notion of sustainability is such a broad term. It covers so much ground. It's kind of ambiguous. And, as a strategy professor, I think that's actually a good thing, right? That as a strategist, you gravitate toward situations of ambiguity, because once everything has been locked down, right, and kind of submitted to standard operating procedures, then all of the money was made a long time ago. So I think sustainability it offers tremendous strategic opportunity, but in order for us to sort of take advantage of that, we need a way of thinking about it in strategy terms. So that's what I'd like to do today. And this problem with imprecision, with the idea that sustainability is kind of a buzzword, is even bigger than just the term sustainability, because there are literally dozens and dozens of derivative buzzwords. And here I just put up a short list, right, of the buzzwords that are floating around out there. And it's indicative of how much ground the term sustainability covers. As you look over this list, you will no doubt see some terms that are very familiar, maybe terms that you're intimately, that you're working in, kind of closely and intimately. Others maybe you're aware of, maybe a little less cognizant of. Still others that you probably say, like, what is that, right? That there's so much ground that this covers, that it can be exceedingly difficult to get a grip on. And if as a leader, as a business leader, you're faced with a laundry list of terms like this, all sort of confronted with this all at once, your first reaction, which I think is a natural reaction, is to say, like, what am I supposed to do with all this? Like I have a particular job in the company. I don't know what to do with this, with such a wide range of challenges. So what I'd like to do is to try to wrestle this to the ground, right? To give a sort of a strategic framework for thinking about it, so that we can actually make sense of this just wide-ranging morass of terms and challenges. So let me start then with just a way of thinking about shareholder value creation, right? Because the title of the talk was creating sustainable value. And that's all about how we translate sustainability into business opportunity. But in order to do that, we need sort of an easy way, an organized way of thinking about what companies need to do in order to drive long-term value. And what I'm about to present really is not rocket science. I think of it as sort of a 2x2 way of thinking about the balanced scorecard. It's very simple-minded, but I think most everyone will agree with what I'm about to present. Bruce mentioned, a book, Capitalism at the Crossroads. This book goes into this in a lot more depth. But it's pretty much as follows, that any company, to be successful over the long term, and again, I'm not talking just about short-term performance or driving up the stock price in the short term or just short-term profitability, even though that's what Wall Street, pressures many of us to do. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. But what I'm presenting here is what companies need to do if they're interested in creating a long-term value. And obviously the lower part of this matrix, kind of the vertical axis, is kind of obvious, that we must manage today's businesses effectively. And there's an internal component to this and an external component. But we must also simultaneously be building tomorrow's opportunities. That's the top part of the vertical axis. That, again, pretty obvious. But I think the important insight here is that this is not, sort of sequential, that every company must simultaneously be managing today's businesses effectively and building tomorrow's opportunities at the same time. And these are two very different skills. They require very different thinking. They're paradoxical in many ways. They're in conflict in many ways. So as business leaders, we have to think about how we reconcile, the pressures, the kind of the paradox associated with this. And the same thing is true with the horizontal axis, that to be effective as a company long-term, we have to be building and nurturing internal capabilities and technologies and skills. And the best way to do that is to shut the door, kind of shut out disturbance from the outside and just figure out how to get good, how to execute, right? But if we shut out outside voices, then we run the risk of becoming very good at something that is totally out of sync with the world. So we must at the same time be open to engage with external constituencies all the time, right? So the horizontal axis also, there's a tension, right? There's kind of a creative tension and a paradox associated with this. And that's just the nature of business, in my view, from a strategy point of view. And so this 2x2 produces these four quadrants where, lower left, around managing today's business in terms of the internal capabilities, it's all about execution, right? It's driving down cost and risk in order to generate profit, right? That's really what the lower left quadrant is all about. But we can't just be inwardly focused. We must be engaged with external constituencies, both upstream and downstream, as well as more widely, kind of stakeholders out there in the world. If we are to maintain legitimacy, if we were to build reputation, if we were to build brand, that's crucially important in terms of today's business. But if all we do is just think about today's business, then and we're good at, sort of execution, but also maintaining legitimacy and rep, eventually we fly that plane into the ground. We must be simultaneously building tomorrow's skills, repositioning, acquiring new technologies. That's the upper left quadrant. That must be happening all the time. We must be building the kind of the competencies for the future. But yet at the same time, when it comes to building tomorrow's technologies, we might be really good. We might pour a lot of money into R&D, make really wise acquisitions to acquire new skills and competencies and technologies. But if we can't figure out how to apply them effectively on a commercial basis, then that leads nowhere, right? We just pour money down the drain. So the upper right quadrant is all about effectively charting out what our growth path and trajectory for the future is going to be. It can't just be milking today's markets, right? Which is the lower part, the lower right part. We must be creating tomorrow's markets at the same time. So, that's a simple-minded way of thinking about what we need to do to be effective in terms of driving long-term value, this 2x2. And what I'd like to do now is take that as sort of a base model and then figure out how the challenges of sustainability actually kind of apply. How can we translate those into strategies that can actually drive value on all four of these dimensions? So to do that, what I'd like to do is take that long list of buzzwords that you saw just a moment ago and sort them into the four quadrants. Because if we do that, then this wide-ranging kind of morass of buzzwords begins to make a whole lot more sense. So if we start with the lower left quadrant, which is where I think the whole sustainable business movement began, in terms of driving down cost and risk, we see buzzwords like greening, emission reduction, eco-efficiency, zero waste, ESG, risk management, waste reduction, resource productivity. This is broadly a set of buzzwords that rotate around what I'll call pollution prevention. Again, you can choose any label you like, but I think this is a distinctive strategy. This is where kind of things began back in the late 80s, early 90s with companies like 3M and Dow and DuPont and others. Chemical industry probably was first in this because they were under so much pressure back in the day. And this one, I think came first because it fit easily into the existing drive to drive down cost and risk and improve profitability. Pollution prevention, waste reduction, kind of, cutting energy use, facility eco-efficiency. This drops to the bottom line immediately. So it fits well within kind of the shareholder primacy model of short-termism, which is why I think it came to light first. In most companies, this is pretty well developed. Most of the low-hanging fruit's been picked already, and which is why I think things have moved on over the last decade or two beyond just this notion of eco-efficiency and pollution prevention. And I'd say now, this lower right quadrant is probably where the most active work is happening within companies, within large corporations at least. And here we see a set of buzzwords like lifecycle management, design for environment, stakeholder management, sustainable sourcing, full cost accounting, take back, transparency, corporate citizenship, lifecycle management. This is, as Bruce was referring to earlier, those set of upstream and downstream challenges that companies face. The lower left is about facilities, it's scope 1 and scope 2. The lower right is scope 3, right? We'll call it product stewardship, right? It has to do with sustainable sourcing, the topic of the day for the conference, but also the downstream piece in terms of products in use, end of life, and so forth. It's the entire life cycle management process of the firm. And I'd say this is probably where the most active work is happening now today in companies. It's all about brand building. It's all about reputation. It's all about building legitimacy, engaging external stakeholders in making today's business better, right? The lower part of the model is about continuously improving today's products and processes. That's what it's about. But we can't just be satisfied with that, right? That, as we said before, if all we do is continuously improve what we already do in the core business, eventually we fly that plane into the ground. So we must also be addressing the upper part of the model. In fact, I'll argue that that's probably the most important thing looking forward from a sustainability point of view. And here in the upper left, we see a set of buzzwords like eco-effectiveness, biomimicry. There's a good one, right? Some of you may have heard of. Leapfrog technology, sustainable technology, knowledge and service intensity, cradle to cradle, closed loop, circularity, restorative tech, lots of buzzwords there, right? But all of these have to do with sort of leapfrogging, right? Kind of getting to what comes next. The Bill McDonoughism of eco-effectiveness versus eco-efficiency, how to be more good, right, versus less bad. The lower left is all about, kind of reducing negative impact. The upper left is about tomorrow's technologies that can actually be what Paul Pullman and Andrew Winson call net positive. So we'll call this a strategy of clean technologies, and this will often be disruptive to the current business. So if we take the dry cleaning industry as an example, right, most of us get at least some of our clothes dry cleaned and may realize that by doing that, we're wearing a bunch of toxics around on our back. The main chemical used in today's dry cleaning is perchloroethylene, which is a pretty nasty chemical, which is why, the dry cleaning industry has not concentrated. It's still mom and pop shops. Nobody wants to own, hundreds and hundreds of toxic sites. But what we see happening now is the beginnings of creative destruction. There are a bunch of new entrants in this space using different technologies. In some cases, things like supercritical CO2. If you take CO2 and put it under pressure, it turns to a liquid. And you can develop a whole set of new soaps and surfactants that work extremely well in the liquid CO2 environment. Clean clothes, take pressure off the CO2 without using energy, or at least much energy. So the drying of clothes becomes much more energy efficient. You can reuse the soaps and surfactants. Clothes come out clean. There's no toxics involved. It's a clean process. This is sort of a clean technology strategy, and its intent is to make perk-based dry cleaning obsolete. So the upper left quadrant is all about creative destruction, kind of Clayton Christensen disruptive innovation thinking, right? And within companies, that's what we need to be doing as well, simultaneously with what we're doing in the lower part of the model. But if all we do is develop these technologies and not really sort of figure out how we're going to apply them effectively out there and on a commercial basis, that doesn't get us where we need to go either. So the upper right quadrant really is about creating tomorrow's markets, right? So it's things like sustainable development in terms of our buzzword sort, pro-poor business, urban reinvestment, DEI externally, not just thinking about it as an HR challenge, climate justice, empowering women and girls, inclusive capitalism, racial justice, social entrepreneurship, radical transactiveness. What is that? And I'll talk about that in a moment. B to 4B means business to 4 billion. This upper right quadrant is all about, we'll call it base of the pyramid. This is all about those communities, places, people, demographics that we traditionally have ignored or not served, those that have been, sort of either underserved, poorly served, or even actively exploited in many cases. Right here in the US, but also around the world, in terms of the developing world and emerging economies, in rural villages and urban slums and shanty towns. Here in the US, it would be brownfield sites, it would be underserved communities, it would be underserved demographics. These are the markets of the future. And from a sustainability point of view, this is crucial, right? From a social equity standpoint, how do we serve and lift the underserved? That's what strategies for base of the pyramid are all about. And in many cases, those clean technologies, those new technologies that reside in the upper left quadrant are, often distributed in character, are small scale in application, can be brought to bear commercially first in this underserved space, right? So you can combine clean technology and base of the pyramid in terms of leapfrogging and disruption. So the upper part of the model follows a different strategic logic, right? Which is very different from the lower part, which is more about continuously improving the current incumbent business. So we can think about this then as kind of a portfolio. Every company has a portfolio of initiatives, of investments, of activities, of skills, of competence in these four strategies. Kind of pollution prevention from an auto industry point of view, as Bruce was saying, or if you think about it even in terms of procurement, is all about scope 1 and 2 emissions and particularly greenhouse gas emissions these days, right? OEMs are pressuring suppliers to both cut first of all, disclose them, measure them and disclose, and then figure out how to cut not just greenhouse gas emissions, but all emissions. So pollution prevention remains front and center. In fact, it may be the first sort of line, for many suppliers to take on when it comes to OEM pressure. But product stewardship, kind of the scope 3 notion, I think is again where a lot of the kind of current reality pressures are coming from. How to get after these upstream and downstream from an OEM point of view, how to get after these and deal with them from a sourcing standpoint and from a product and use point of view. Bruce mentioned a bunch of ways that that's happening, but I think one that's really interesting, if you look at aluminum and the role that Novelis, right, the closed loop aluminum supplier that has really sought to become the world's first above ground miner, right? Their goal as a company is to cut off, their relationship with bauxite mining and smelting, right? To become largely a closed loop aluminum supplier where recycled aluminum uses 95% energy and emits 95% fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and is also cheaper, right? And a lot of that logic is what drove, Ford to incorporate aluminum into the F-150, just as an example. both from an upstream and downstream point of view, product and use, it improves fuel efficiency pretty dramatically. So, this notion of product stewardship, critically important, right? If we think about today's products, right, and just in terms of how we improve them, scope 3 in product stewardship is front and center in terms of strategic thinking. But then I think increasingly it's the upper part of the model, and starting with the upper left piece, what are the clean technologies of tomorrow that we need to be thinking about? As Bruce outlined, it's all about it's about EVs, it's about the opportunity in fuel cells and hydrogen and new materials altogether, in the problems and challenges of sourcing rare earth metals, in using biomaterials and incorporating those, in reinventing supply chains altogether. So I think this upper left quadrant, kind of the era we live in, where we're going to need to leapfrog and deploy the sustainable competencies of the future, hold huge challenges for suppliers and supply chains. I think supply chains are just simply going to be transformed. That we're already in the process of that in the coming decade or so. So the upper left kind of quadrant we're living that right now, and over the next decade, I think we'll see this sort of disruptive nature come home in a serious way. But I think so too will the upper right quadrant in terms of serving the underserved. Increasingly, I think we're challenged to figure out how we create mobility for everyone, right? That, like in the developing world, this is front and center. You look at attempts like the Tata Nano in India, right, to bring kind of the people's car forward. The $2,000 car. Now it experienced some difficulties in implementation, but I think the fact remains, that we'll see more and more of those types of initiatives. How do we make mobility affordable and sustainable at the same time, right? In terms of here at home, rural areas with EVs and charging infrastructure, urban areas with those that are underserved. How do we bring urban underserved communities forward in terms of mobility? These are the challenges that we face, and increasingly that'll be part of the strategic thinking. It already is, right, of many OEMs, and by implication their suppliers. So I think when you think of this notion of sustainable value creation, it's about this entire portfolio and how do we get after it. So you can think, the question becomes, what is the portfolio? What's your portfolio as a company? How would you chart yourself, right? And I think if you give this some thought, begin to sort of chart out the initiatives, the investments, the skills and capabilities in each of these 4 quadrants, probably most people listening in the companies where you're from would have to, if you're honest, would have to say the bulk of the investments, the bulk of the portfolio is in the lower part, still to this day. There's some investments in clean technology and base of the pyramid, to be sure, but the bulk probably is still down in the lower part of the model. Kind of, we'll call them the evolutionary routines. They're about continuous improvement. They're about incremental change, right? They're about being less bad, of taking the edge off what we're already doing, as opposed to creating tomorrow's opportunity. Now, increasingly, we're getting into into that upper part. Obviously, the commitment a company like GM has made to EVs is indicative of that. But I would still have to say probably most companies, especially supplier companies, are in the lower part of the model. That's kind of the green strategies for greening, of continuous improvement. Whereas the upper part I call beyond greening, I think is where the opportunity lies for the future. In fact, if we look at the challenges that we face out there, the majority of S&P 500 CEOs say that their company won't be economically viable within the next 10 years as pressures build for climate disruption, sustainability, and AI. This is a recent survey from PwC. This is exactly what CEOs are saying. So staying in the lower part of this model is clearly not going to get it done, right? That it's going to be necessary to move aggressively into the upper part of this model of that. But this requires more revolutionary routines, right? It's not business as usual. This is disruptive, right? This is creative destruction, in Schumpeter's words. So it's how do we get to tomorrow's technology, tomorrow's markets? And in this regard, I wrote a piece, entitled "Beyond Greening: Strategies for a Sustainable World." Was in Harvard Business Review. It won the McKinsey Award. And I have a little quote here. I X'd out the dates because I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question in a moment. But here's a little quote from the piece. But the distance we've traveled will seem small when in 30 years we look back on the whatever decade it is. Beyond greening lies an enormous challenge and an enormous opportunity. The challenge is to develop a sustainable global economy. Greening has been framed in terms of risk reduction, reengineering, or cost cutting. Rarely is greening linked to strategy or technology development. The achievement of sustainability will mean billions of dollars in products, services, and technologies that barely exist today. And so I asked at the beginning the rhetorical question, when was this article published? Some of you might think, well, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And the answer is more than 25 years ago. So the simple fact is we have not come very far over the last 25 or 30 years. We've remained in the lower part of this model. And that's what that's produced is a crisis, right, on our hands that, as Tom Friedman says, we've arrived at the time of the great disruption when both Mother Nature and Father Greed hit the wall at the same time. We're out of on-ramp, right? There really is no luxury of time left when it comes to this, which is kind of the core message of this new book that Bruce mentioned, Beyond Shareholder Primacy, Remaking Capitalism for a Sustainable Future. I think as companies, we need to be thinking in terms of, what Paul Pullman and Andrew Winson call net positive advocacy, right? It's really about creating a new operating system for capitalism that will allow us to aggressively move to the upper part of the model, to the beyond greening part of the model. And here as an example, I give in the book something called the long-term stock exchange. Very interesting kind of new venture, not even new anymore, out on the West Coast, started by a guy named Eric Ries. Some of you may know him, kind of the author of the Lean Startup, where the idea behind the long-term stock exchange is to create a new objective function in public equity markets that today's public equity markets, like the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ and so forth, have become so consumed with short-termism and quarterly earnings growth that is driving us, driving us over the cliff. So long-term stock exchange, if you want to be listed as a company on the long-term stock exchange, you must demonstrate a long-term strategy. You must demonstrate a strategy that serves all the stakeholders. And if you want to invest in the long-term stock exchange, there's no short-term trading. So it's essentially created a new set of rules, a new operating system that drives companies, in a new direction, in an important direction to think more long-term that would enable kind of getting to the upper part of the model much more aggressively, because it simply hasn't happened over the last 25, 30 years, under the rules of shareholder primacy. So I think this is increasingly the challenge we face, and business leaders are faced with becoming advocates for this. Because, we see more and more work in this area, right? Kind of reimagining capitalism, in a world on fire, which it is, can American capitalism survive? And even Peter Georgescu, the former CEO of the ad firm Young and Rubicon, has come out, capitalists arise. The past 4 decades, capitalism has been slowly committing suicide, deliver earnings, push up stock price, or perish. Simply put, shareholder primacy has become a kind of cancer that needs to be eradicated before it destroys our way of life. That's pretty aggressive, but I think he's right, and if I were to just then kind of close and summarize, we need in the most serious way to move our attention from strategies for greening, which we've been totally preoccupied with over the last 30 years, kind of focusing on the continuous improvement of existing products, processes, suppliers, customers, shareholders, and so forth, kind of the win-win rhetoric. How do we build the business case for sustainability, leveraging and improving existing competencies to become, sort of more sustainable? That's just not gotten us where we need to go. And I think the agenda for the future is moving aggressively towards strategies for beyond greening, which is about new technologies, inherently clean, regenerative technologies, about creating new markets of the future, building new partnerships, new supply bases, a new supply chain, serving unmet needs, with new stakeholders, not just the existing core stakeholders, thinking in terms of becoming net positive, not just less bad, building the new competencies of the future, and thinking increasingly about future fit and kind of system reinvention. That's our agenda, I think. That's the strategy agenda for the future. This is what we'll be talking about a bit in this new program that Bruce mentioned, at the Ross School, Sustainable Leadership in the ESG Era. The first offering, Bruce, will actually be in September, but I'll just leave this up here for people to have a look at as we go forward. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, Stuart. Thanks a lot for a great presentation. We've got some questions for you.
Sure.
And I think you did a nice job of relating back to automotive and in your examples of the four quadrants. When it comes to, and I think you pretty much answered one of the earlier questions about where in the auto industry do you see opportunities for different for sustainability. But one of the areas that we're challenged with, and I think I'm going to take you back to to the bottom of the quadrant, because I think that's where we still are, and that's we're still trying to work our way through the metrics and the measurement. What metrics do you recommend for companies when they're starting to, well, at least to work through the lower quadrant before they get into the upper quadrant?
I mean, I actually think that's a pretty well-developed space, right? The kind of the eco-efficiency quadrant. Most companies now have a pretty well-developed, kind of dashboard of sustainability goals, right? But even our next speaker, GM, right? Sustainability goals. If you look at most large corporations' sustainability goals, they are in the lower space, right? They relate largely to scope 1 and 2. Probably the bulk of the sustainability goals that companies develop have to do with, energy use, water use, DEI, things like that. I think the metrics associated with the lower part of the model have been pretty well developed. Increasingly, even the scope 3 goals, you have science-based targets, you have a range of, I think, pretty well-developed metrics that are already out there that are easy to access and have a look at. It's the upper part of the model, I think, where we're most challenged to think about how do we measure and challenge ourselves as businesses to get to the upper part of the model. And there, sort of in this new book that the Beyond Shareholder Primacy book, I draw the distinction between foundational goals, right? That, in other words, I think most sustainability goals that companies have are foundational in character. In other words, they can be led by functional leadership, right? They can be led by, the manufacturing and facilities part of the company when it comes to facility eco-efficiency, energy use, water use, and so forth. They can be led by HR when it comes to DEI. They can be led by the procurement organization when it has to do with sustainable sourcing and supply chain. They can be led by R&D, right? When it comes to building competencies, internal competencies through R&D and that sort of thing. But none of those things really get us to tomorrow's business, right? So I draw a distinction between foundational goals, which I think are well developed in terms of metrics, versus business aspirations, right? And the only way that we really get to, the upper part of the model is by engaging people on the business side of the company, product leadership, business leadership, kind of geographic leadership, business leadership, leaders of country organizations and that sort of thing, in the development of actual business aspirations. A business aspiration has to have revenue targets, right? Or else it's not a business aspiration. I think most sustainability goals are not built that way, right? They are foundational in character. So for me, the big challenge is how do companies take on the sustainability challenge by articulating actual business aspirations, which means both societal and business goals embedded at the same time. Revenue targets and profitability targets for new products and services, for new business directions in the upper part of the model. And then even beyond that, right, to how do we get companies to take on the larger systemic challenges that are going to be necessary to pull companies into the future? I call those corporate quests. So I've developed sort of framework for thinking about this in this new book called Beyond Shareholder Primacy.
Stuart, are there some companies that are or countries that are better at this than others?
Well, I think that probably the conventional wisdom is that Europe, right, has kind of moved more aggressively in this direction. And I think there is truth to that when it comes to things like reporting. Sort of in Europe, reporting is now mandatory, but pretty much any company that does business in Europe, it's mandatory at this point, right? The corporate sustainability reporting directive in Europe sort of requires that that's the case, and that will include scope 3 stuff, right? So scope 3 will increasingly become mandatory, even before the SEC. I mean, the SEC's kind of stuck at the moment here in the US, but between Europe and California, I think it basically is mandatory for global companies. But to be honest with you, I think some of the more interesting and creative thinking is coming from the developing world, right? That where, for example, I just got back. I was in India last week. You see kind of the sort of upper left and upper right, especially leapfrogging, sort of more disruptive strategies really beginning to take hold in places like Africa and India and even in China, right? Where you see these sort of more disruptive, inherently clean, regenerative strategies that are leapfrogging to serving the underserved. There's some really creative thinking and work going on in the developing world and in emerging economies that I think American companies can really benefit from looking at.
Very good, thank you. We were looking at one of the issues had to do with you were talking about there's some established metrics for this. Some of my reading made it sound like there's too many metrics. like there's overwhelmingly numbers of ways of doing this.
Yeah.
Do you have one in particular that you feel that is one that you feel is the strongest?
I really don't, right? I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to the lower part of the model, we're drowning in metrics, right? And so I think it's important for companies to figure out which metrics are really of strategic significance for them. And the best way to do that, I think, is to think about the entire portfolio at the same time. In other words, don't just think about the lower left quadrant, sort of in isolation. Think about think about the entire lower part of the model, kind of think about the entire life cycle strategy you have for products and services and businesses. And then also think about where you're looking to get to for the future in the upper part of the model. And that'll help winnow down and sort of shake out the panoply of potential metrics that exist out there and allow you to zero in on the ones that would be of most strategic relevance to your company. I think a lot of times companies just look for, it's sort of compliance behavior. Tell us which metrics we need to, give us the metrics that we need to comply with. I don't think that's a constructive way to think about it. Select metrics based on what's of strategic significance to you as a company moving forward.
Okay, thank you. One of our attendees here has a question for you. You spoke about changing the stock exchange listing requirements. What are your thoughts about private lenders and commercial bank criteria?
Yeah, in terms of debt financing, right? So I think I mean there's debt and then there's equity, right? And so I've probably focused more on the challenges of private equity than debt financing, because I think the private equity world it kind of is probably driving us that's of greater significance when it comes to the sustainability challenges, since the private equity market has exploded, right, in recent years. But I think both public equity public equity, I think, is more subject to the kinds of changes we're talking about because it's more visible, whereas private equity is relatively invisible, right? And so I think in a lot of ways that's of greatest concern that I think there's growing pressure in public equity markets to rethink what metrics are real drivers of value. And again, I have a chapter in this new book, the title of which is redefining the meaning of value. Because if you think about it in terms of current public equity markets, there's nothing sacred about quarterly earnings growth as being the primary value driver of stock price. It's a narrative, right? It's a social construction that's been perpetrated on us over the last 30 or 40 years by the Chicago School of Economics and by business schools, of which I've been complicit. I've been a business school professor for 35 years. But there's nothing, especially in public equity markets that are pure trading markets, there's nothing sacred about that at all, right? We could decide that reinvestment rate should be the driver of share price, and we could prohibit once again share buybacks, which were prohibited, from shortly after the Great Depression until the early 80s. But now we have $1 trillion a year in share buybacks to drive up short-term stock price. We could just simply say that henceforth, right, if we reach a consensus in a trading market, that share buybacks are no longer considered legitimate, and reinvestment rate becomes the driver of share price. I mean, these are the kinds of changes that the long-term stock exchange is looking to drive. When it comes to debt, I think debt markets, I think, are much, at least I know less about debt markets, but it strikes me that, kind of debt financing and debt markets have been more stable over time, right, than what's happened with equity financing. That the public equity markets and what drives value over the last 40 years have shifted in significant ways. If you just look back to even the 60s and what companies were rewarded for in the public equity markets, it was entirely different than it is now. So we've seen this, tremendous sort of change in value, what drives value in public equity markets over that period of time. And it's time for us to transform that once again.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, close to the last question here. How can companies push for a shift to the upper parts of the model when infrastructure is lacking to support a quick transition for new technology and also for the DEI efforts that are facing legal assaults?
Yeah, sort of two different questions.
Yeah,
Two different
yeah,
questions.
yeah.
Yeah, so the first one has to do with the larger infrastructural challenges, right? So to me, that's why it becomes increasingly important for corporations, especially large corporations, to really take on these larger systemic challenges, right? So I think of those as corporate quests, right? That no longer is it possible for companies just to sort of live and spend their time thinking about their four walls or even their value chain or even their industry, right? That increasingly it becomes important for companies to become advocates for larger system change. And that's new territory. That's not something, that corporate leadership have over the last 30 or 40 years been terribly engaged in. But I think it's crucially important that that happen. It's starting to happen. We see more and more of that sort of activity going on. But I think that's crucial. I think it's really the corporate world that can help drive infrastructural change, kind of lead the charge toward tomorrow's infrastructure that can then pull the kinds of strategies that companies would like to undertake in the upper part of the 2x2 more rapidly into the future. So I think that's it, right? That company leaders have to become advocates for wider system change and infrastructure change, and to sort of put their money where their mouth is as well in helping lead the charge toward that. When it comes to, DEI, unfortunately, has become one of these politically loaded things, which is terribly regrettable, I would say, kind of given what, but the way I think about that is rather than restricting the thinking about DEI to HR inside companies, expand thinking to the role of the company out in the world, right? That how can the companies, and this is the upper right quadrant, right? How can companies construct strategies that actually address inequality, that address social justice, that address racial inequality through its business strategy? Is the way I think that's where there's real traction, perhaps where the greatest impact could be achieved is through the scope 3 activities of companies, not just scope 1 and 2.
Very good. All right, Stuart, we're going to let you go. I'm sorry you
Yep.
can't stick with us to join in the other Q&As, but thanks again for your time and great insight into the work that you're doing. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
So Fred Gersdorf is a senior manager, socially responsible for socially responsible and sustainable supply chains at General Motors. He has a wealth of knowledge working in the medical devices, power distribution, and automotive industries. Fred currently leads the sustainability efforts in GM's global purchasing and supply chain organization. Fred's educational background is in chemistry, complemented by an MBA, reflects his interdisciplinary approach. Currently pursuing a PhD in systems engineering, he continues to expand his knowledge and expertise in order to make a lasting impact. Welcome, Fred.
Thanks for having me, Bruce. Really appreciate the opportunity to share the work we're doing within GM, the work we're doing with our suppliers, and then how it really fits into some of the larger items that Stuart was talking about in terms of moving our whole society forward in sustainability. So with that, let me move this deck forward. I want to kick off by sharing a quote that's been very impactful to me. It says, in the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand. And we will understand only what we are taught. And this is relevant to supply chain sustainability because as you'll see through my presentation, there is an undercurrent of the need for an OEM like General Motors, like others, to step out in a leadership position and educate, coach, and bring along their supply chains in this journey of becoming more sustainable. For General Motors, sustainability starts with the vision of zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. A few years ago, Mary Barra came out publicly and said, in addition to these 000 vision, she also wants GM to be the most inclusive company in the world. That's relevant to our supply chain in the area that I work, because my vice president has also shared that he wants a supply chain of suppliers that are the most inclusive in the world as well. So from this core of a vision of 000 and inclusivity, we can move forward and start to build out the sustainability program at GM. To understand how big this program is and what the reach is, I've got this slide from one of our sustainability reports. And you can see here that, this fluctuates a bit year to year. But in this year, where I grabbed this report from last year, we had a supply chain spend of $88.2 billion. And that spend was stretched over 16,000 suppliers. So when we think of GM's reach and the power of our supply chain, bringing our suppliers along on sustainability, we start to see very quickly with these sized numbers just how impactful that can be on the overall sustainability for our planet. So when we dig down the next layer to understand these emissions within GM, to understand sustainability, I've got this slide here that shows the importance of our supply chain, shared the financial size of the supply chain, shared just how many suppliers we have. But now we start to see the impact of the supply chain itself on GM's overall emissions. The largest group of emissions within GM is the scope 1 and 2 emissions, which, I'm sorry, the scope 3 emissions for the use of our vehicles is the largest share at 75%. And then a much smaller share is our scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is roughly 1 to 2% depending on the year. When we look at our supply chain impacts, we look at things like our inbound logistics, we look at our outbound logistics, and we look at our purchased goods and services. We add all of that up. That's roughly 10 to 20 times, depending on the year, the size of our internal carbon footprint for our own facilities. It's still dwarfed by the use of our sold products. As Stuart mentioned, GM is on this journey for an all EV future. So in that way, we've got a plan for the 75. We're working that plan in our products. And then we've got the supply chain that pops up as the next largest emitting source that we need to be working on. So that's why I'm here today to talk about that and the work that my team does with our suppliers to reduce those emissions. Another way to think about this is to understand, now that we've kind of built this 20% of GM emissions, or what we buy and how we ship, you start to look at, where does it fall in this supply chain? Well, very little falls in the tier 1 supply chain. Those are GM's direct suppliers, those suppliers we have contracts with directly. The vast majority of the supply chain emissions is deeper in the supply chain, the tier 2, the tier 3, all the way back to a mine or a farm or a recycled material. That's the vast majority of the emissions. You can see 56% is in those tier 2, tier 3, and then overall 82% in our lower tiers of our supply chain. What's also very impactful for our program and how we think about reducing emissions, driving sustainability, and building supplier capability is to look at the difficulty of getting at some of these numbers. I know there was a question earlier asked of Stuart, what are the right metrics? That's an important question to ask. There are lots of lists out there. And I can weigh in, and I will weigh in a little bit later on what's important to GM. What's also critical to GM is an ancillary piece to sustainability, which is the visibility. And you can see on the right-hand side here that when organizations were asked how much visibility they have on GHG emissions, roughly a quarter of them said minimal. Another 40-ish% said, well, they've got tier 1 supplier visibility. And you can see how that quickly drops off. Tier 2 visibility of emissions is down to 30%. And by the time you get to tier 3 or further down the supply chain, it gets really small, less than 10%. So you can see here this interesting dichotomy where the emissions of a supply chain are deeper in the supply chain, at least in the case of General Motors, it's that way. And then you can see overall from the industry that it's recognized it's difficult to get at that information. So one of the things that we push for within General Motors and we work with our suppliers on is to get supply chain maps. When we have maps of lower tiers in our supply chain, we're able to model the emissions better. We're able to reach out and connect for risks and opportunities deeper in the supply chain in a way that we can't when we don't know where those nodes are in the supply chain. So to answer the right-hand side, where does GM fall on this? I would say that we've got a great handle on the tier 1 highest emitting suppliers and the suppliers we do the most business with. And then for select critical supply chains, we are getting information deeper into the supply chain, all the way back to the mine. So in that way, we fall into that tier one, having quite a bit of information, and then in select supply chains going down, we understand that more, and that's something that we know that we need to build out as we move forward. Further building the case on the importance of the supply chain and the need for our suppliers to have information, to be empowered, and to work with General Motors to address sustainability is this chart on the left-hand side. And what it shows is that conflicting priorities for suppliers and sub-tier suppliers, it is tied for number one for the greatest barriers to driving forward with sustainability in the supply chain. I know that because I've seen this chart. I know that because I talk with my suppliers. And even the largest suppliers of General Motors have very small sustainability teams. And of that, a subset of that is an even smaller group of folks and resources where those suppliers say, we've dedicated those to working deeper into our supply chain. And you can see here some of the challenges that my suppliers face when driving sustainability forward. So this informs my strategy on how to support them. And then also going back to Stuart, I was taking notes the whole time you were talking. Really impactful, and I think it correlates well with what Stuart shared earlier, is that sustainability in a supply chain has been a slow go. You can see here when GM has collected climate and water information from our suppliers, our tier one suppliers, we also ask them questions about how they are engaging their supply chain. And you can see over 2020, 2021, 2022, that it's been rather flat in climate. You might give me a little bit of a bone and say, hey, Fred, you ticked up a few percent there in 2022, but overall pretty flat. And water has been absolutely flat at roughly only a quarter of our tier one suppliers asking and driving water related sustainability concerns and data collection deeper into the supply chain. Another way to look at that is supplier engagement being critical as a recognized path for procurement professionals to drive ESG into their own operations and their supply chain. So you can see over on the just to the right of supplier engagement, we can see procurement professionals say collaboration and internal stakeholders are the most critical element to driving supply chain sustainability. The next most important is supplier engagement. We know that we need to have our suppliers along for the journey, and a way to do that, back to my original quote, is to be able to teach and educate and bring my suppliers along. You can see just rounding out that list of enablers. We've got relevance to the business. So that's a key point, that as you build out your metrics for sustainability, they need to be aligned to your business, and they also need to be aligned to your stakeholders, both your customers, your suppliers, outside stakeholders, outside of the natural or normal supply chain, getting that feedback to understand what is material for a supplier's business. And that's something that we've talked about often within our supply chain. And then finding the money to make this happen is also critical. Just a couple more slides to outline the challenges that my suppliers face when looking at sustainability. This slide shows just how fast the landscape in sustainability is moving and how broad and complex it is. In terms of legislation, looking at forced labor in supply chains, you can go back to the early 1900s on laws that were on the books that made it illegal to import something into the United States. I'm looking through the US lens, to import goods that were known to be made with forced labor. A couple years ago, a law was passed which significantly improved Customs and Border Protection's ability to monitor those goods. And after that, you can start to see this domino effect. We had the Australian Modern Slavery Act. I think that snuck in right before the US work. But you can see all of the laws, and I'm not going to go through them all, but the UK and others in Europe driving forward with their own legislation to address forced labor. Canada has now a disclosure requirement this year on forced labor. And this is something just over the past 5 years, how these things have grown exponentially. So the landscape in the supply chain is very complex. And to share one other view of that is to show not only forced labor, that was just one material risk that can be presented in supply chains, but to look at the breadth now of legislation and regulation coming out. You've got this UFLPA that I talked about, forced labor in the US. But you can see the carbon border adjustment mechanism coming out in Europe. We've got the sustainability reporting directive in Europe. We've got the EU CSDDD, which now goes beyond the output of a supply chain and reporting on the output, but says, hey, I want you to disclose your process for conducting due diligence. So these regulations are stepping a step back further into the operations to understand, are we aligned on how to assess risk, identify risk, deal with risk in the supply chain, and drive for remediation. And then you can see here on the right-hand side, the work that's being done specifically on EV batteries with the EU battery regs, work that's being done in the SEC and the IRA, which is more US focused on driving batteries and EV investment as well as production through the supply chain. So you can see just how complex this landscape is. Once again, many of these laws and regulations coming into effect in just the last few years. So we know that within GM supply chain, as an indicator, 20% of the emissions are coming through what we buy and how we ship. We know that it's tough to gain visibility at lower tiers where most of the emissions sit, and that the regulatory landscape is quickly evolving. So it would be game changing, and it has been game changing, to address the urgent environmental, social, and regulatory needs that suppliers in my supply chain, and I hope others listening that have supply chains, suppliers throughout the supply chain require enhanced levels of support. So truly game changing to not just set up metrics, not just to set up disclosure, but to say, how does an OEM in a leadership position reach back into the supply chain and begin to enhance the level of support that our suppliers need to drive sustainability forward? So now I'm going to start to talk about the work that we do in GM to address those material risks. One of the ways that we get deeper into the supply chain is we now contract directly with those supplying many of our EV raw materials and with mines and processors deeper in the supply chain. So I've got here a snippet from our sustainability report last year, and you can see just all the work that GM is doing that we've made publicly available work with Glencore to get cobalt out of Australia, work that we've done with LG Chem on cathode material. And then just here in February, we had another press announcement, not soon enough to get into what I've got on the screen, but another 19 billion supply agreement with them through 2035 to bring in cathode active material. Work to build processing here in North America with POSCO, looking at getting lithium from Livent from South America, where they do a lot of work, and getting lithium here in the United States through the work that we're doing with Lithium Americas. So that's one way to get into the supply chain, to build capacity deep in the supply chain, is to have a direct relationship. We value all of our suppliers. This is not a strategy to directly source everything in our supply chain. We really rely on those tiers within the supply chain. So we also have begun work to educate our suppliers in a cohort setting to bring forward best practices that we've learned over the last several years working in our supply chain, so they can replicate them in their supply chain. And what I've got here on the screen is I've got a supplier subcouncil that I meet with every 2 weeks, or I've met with them every 2 weeks up until last month, where we finally said, hey, we can back it off to once a month, where they are a body of advisors that I can bring forward plans that I've got in the supply chain and GM is planning, so that we can build plans for the entire supply chain with the collaboration of my suppliers. They also help me from doing foolish things as an OEM. I try to get out of my own head, but it's important that I'm always getting feedback from my suppliers. So there in the middle, we had a call to action to encourage more of our suppliers to take on this best practice of building out their own supplier subcouncils. And we formed these cohorts. We've got 3 of them going now, which puts us up over 50 suppliers, some of our largest suppliers. And we're coaching them how to build their own supplier subcouncils so they can replicate the work deeper in the supply chain. We've got a learning platform within General Motors to be able to educate suppliers. And we take both written content, video content, and we've brought them together under the categories of environmental, social, and governance. And we allow our suppliers through our online portal to access that information 24 hours a day, so that they can take sustainability information in a bite-sized segment, learn an important skill or task, and then go execute it. Very much like YouTube has done. When we think of changing a spark plug, we go to YouTube, we watch that 5-minute video, and then we go execute. We also have large events where we bring in suppliers to online symposiums. We've done symposiums on goal setting. We've done them on energy efficiency. We've done them on human rights. And in that way, we're able to reach several thousand suppliers at one time and bring in experts within GM, outside of GM, other multinationals, to coach our suppliers on what best practices are and how to implement practices within their own operations. And then we've also done these energy webinars, where we've got 200 to 300 suppliers coming in every month to learn about critical energy topics to both reduce their energy usage as well as move to greener energy. The latest addition to educating our suppliers came in January of this year. And just last month, we launched a monthly training opportunity for suppliers to come in and learn about human rights, labor rights, ethics, and compliance for their own operations and their supply chains. We've brought in legal experts within GM, external legal experts, and experts that have been doing human rights for quite some time in supply chains to coach our suppliers. And we've had a really great start to this with over 800 people joining each of those sessions. One of the things that I've seen in my time in sustainability is this pivot from environmental sustainability to a real focus on human rights. And we've had that within our own operations and our supply chain for quite some time through our supplier code of conduct. But I'm seeing an even greater interest in other people as they roll out their supply chain efforts and the risks that are associated there on human rights and labor rights. So picking up the pace here, we also do work where we will work one-on-one with suppliers to coach them through energy efficiency savings. It's one thing to join a webinar or a conference like we're doing today. It's another thing to be able to ask a coach, how do I do this? What should I look for? So in that way, we do have a program where we work one-on-one with suppliers. We also have a program where we will teach smaller groups of suppliers on energy efficiency. We've got a toolbox for them to use, a workbook that even leads to leadership presentations that are made for them so that they can go get that funding that we talked about earlier that can be difficult sometimes in this sustainability space. And then I want to leave you with this wheel. Once again, time back to Stuart when he had Six Sigma black belts down at the bottom of the chart, man after my own heart. We have developed this supplier sustainability roadmap based on Six Sigma and DMAIC. You can see define, measure, analyze, improve, and control with an extra element of disclosure there. And then how it fits into GM's internal procurement processes. And what we've done with suppliers is outline with them how to set interim goals, how to set long-term goals, how to collect GHG emissions and relevant data, how to investigate trends and opportunities within their own operations and supply chain. All important. Okay, now how do I improve this thing? And we've got a lot of tools there that support suppliers as they go to improve. And then the all important, now that we've got better performance, how do we lock in that better performance? And disclosure being critical through the supply chain to let external stakeholders and internal stakeholders know of our progress. And then I want to end with a very impactful thought, which is by investing in suppliers' capability, building up that capability, both within GM and a challenge to anyone who has a supply chain. By doing that, OEMs are investing in all of our sustainable future. So Bruce, thanks for having me come in and speak on GM's supply chain and the work we're doing with suppliers. And love to turn it over to you for some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Fred. Great presentation on the GM story. Really appreciate you taking the time. Got a few questions for you. At the end of your presentation, you were talking about your supplier roadmap process. How long have you been working that particular program?
Yeah, we rolled that out mid last year, maybe early last year.
Yeah.
Started sharing that with suppliers. We've also given this away to others to be able to include in their publications because we see it as an opportunity to grow beyond GM supply chain.
When you look at, and I want to get to one of the themes for the conference,
Mhm.
and it has to do with sustainability as a profitability program. How do you see this supporting your supply base? How does sustainability become profitable for your supply base?
Great question. When I think about sustainability in the supply chain and generating revenue, I think a great example is the work that we're doing in the steel space. So steel is one of the largest emitters in GM's supply chain. It's steel, aluminum, resins, and we get into some battery raw materials, depending on the mix of the vehicle. So what we've done with our steel suppliers is we've gone out, we sent a strong demand signal and said, we are interested in procuring greener, lower emission steel. And for some of those contracts, those come at a premium so that we can lock in those sources of lower emission steel. So in that way, suppliers in that supply chain that have a greener solution are being rewarded with these premiums on that material. I wouldn't, in all fairness, we haven't done that in all supply chains yet. There is an opportunity to generate revenue by using recycled content. So we have done work in the circular economy to bring back recycled content into the supply chain, but this is definitely in the forefront of discussions with our suppliers and or discussions that we're having inside GM. How do we build this ecosystem in the future that goes just beyond goes beyond our highest emitting commodities to more commodities and making it profitable for our suppliers.
Well, it sounds like you're kind of still early on in this whole process, aren't you?
Yeah, we've focused the Pareto principle on the top Pareto, but it definitely is something that that we need to be working on deeper in the supply chain.
Got a number of good questions from our audience here.
Yeah.
How do you manage your teaching role, which is honorable, with your cost management role, which is reality? It seems like there's a time and corporation conflict there.
Hmm. So I've got a team that supports me, and we've got, folks that are focused on the training piece. And then we've got folks that are driving sustainability forward in terms of the metrics and expectations of suppliers. So in that way, we're doing both at the same time, and a strategy that's heavy in one and not in the other really, if you're too heavy on the metrics and you're not building that long-term capability, you're looking for a short-term gain. Vice versa, you're not really driving and setting expectations strong enough. So it is a balance, but we see the need for both.
Here's an interesting question about China, and EVs. Now, China dominates the entire EV supply chain in many ways. How does GM manage to get the information from the Chinese suppliers and also dealing with the ongoing societal concerns about economic dependence on China?
Yeah, great question. So we've got supply chains in the battery space that definitely flow through China, flow through non-North American countries. We also have, I just pressed the wrong button. Sorry about that, guy. There we go. We also have North American supply chains as well. For our entire supply chain, we send out surveys, mapping surveys to get information of our supply chain, the players in the supply chain, where they fit in the nodes of the supply chain, so that then we're able to reach out to them and conduct further compliance surveys. We've sent out over 4,000 surveys last year. Actually, we received over 4,000 surveys back from our supply chain in terms of compliance questionnaires. And then we also use a tool called EcoBotus, which allows us to capture information from our suppliers in terms of social, labor practices, environmental practices, compliance practices in our supply chain. And I know that there are a group of my suppliers that then also have that in their supply chain. So we're able to have those social compliance measures, back to the last part of your question, captured through those surveys. And in some cases, we'll go and audit.
Yeah, it's a very challenging programs you have here in terms of measuring this stuff throughout the supply chain. One of the questions here has to do with the difficulty to get accurate emission data from lower tier suppliers like tier 3 and tier 4, especially the lower tier suppliers in China. Do you have any difficulty in getting this emission data from those suppliers?
So it's a mix. Depending on the supply chain, it can be easier than other parts of the supply chain. The battery supply chain has regulations that are going to be coming into effect next year and as we move forward. And in that way, we've got all of the battery raw material supply chain working on capturing their emissions information. For the larger suppliers, deeper in the supply chain, they've been doing this for quite some time, and then the smaller players, it is a challenge. And working with them we've had conferences where we will bring in and teach them, show them free carbon calculating tools. They don't have the refinement that some other tools have, but we see it as a journey of starting simple and then building up from there.
So as you talked about, this is an ongoing process for you guys as it is for them as well.
Yeah.
What do you see as the next steps that need to be taken in measuring and reporting company sustainability in the U.S.?
So the next steps are really process steps. The next steps are ensuring that everyone in the supply chain has a strong due diligence program and process, and that then they have strong disclosures as well. So when I think about moving sustainability forward in the US, I think of this model in Europe, where they do have strong disclosure requirements and they've got strong due diligence processes. So for most of the OEMs that I'm aware of, most of the multinationals, they've got this down pat. They've been doing that for quite some time. But in order to drive sustainability forward, we've got to go deeper in the supply chain, and I would focus on the disclosure and then the due diligence.
Fred, have you guys been looking at life cycle analysis throughout the supply chain?
We have. That's a really interesting story and really relevant to ongoing work. So if you're familiar, which I'm sure some of you are, with the automotive landscape, there are OEMs in Europe that are already requesting LCAs regularly in their process. And within GM, I've been working with that supplier subcouncil to be deliberate in our approach to capturing LCA information. It's one thing for a supplier to produce it with fidelity. It's another thing to collect it, store it, and then the other piece is using it. To answer this, I also have to give one other data point, which is when I talk with suppliers, they say, Fred, please be careful not to introduce new ways to collect more data and to do this cross-functionally across all of automotive. So in that way, we've been working with that supplier subcouncil and some external organizations to find a tool within the automotive supply chain that could work very similar to the IMDS system, which captures what materials are in each part. And it starts from the lowest parts of the supply chain and it rolls up. That's a really great model for thinking about how to capture primary emissions data from lower tiers and having it roll up in a way that by the time it gets to an OEM, all of that data is available. So there's work being done in that IMDS organization, as well as some work being done by a group named Katina X, building out a communications protocol within automotive to be able to capture that information. So I desperately want this LCA information, but I want to do it in a way that's cross-functional across automotive so that I'm not putting an excess burden on my suppliers.
Yeah, I could see a lot of situations where there'd be overlap and things getting double counted or triple counted, depending on where you are in the supply chain. So it gets very tricky in terms of that. But the LCA does give you a lot of information about how things are organized. This was something that was done. I think the U of M started this back in the 90s. One of my colleagues, Greg Keolian from what at the time was called Natural Resources, that has a completely new name now. It has to do with sustainability, and they did the kind of a tear down of the Ford F-150 Lightning, and looked at all the different pieces of that and the effects in the supply chain on that vehicle. It's a fascinating story, but that's just one vehicle. And thinking about doing that across every vehicle in the corporation, that's quite a charge for anybody to do.
Yes.
When you look at your suppliers, when you talk to your suppliers, are they more receptive to changes in the environmental strategies or the social strategies, or both?
I think they're open to both for sure. But as you can imagine, we've got a normal distribution on responses and they span the gamut. I would say that the social aspects generally are related to regulatory compliance and have real regulatory issues if someone has a social compliance risk that they're not addressing. So in that way, when I talk to suppliers and we have to talk about those sorts of risks, I get an immediate response and full engagement. The environmental piece, like I said, we've got some that are very advanced and I'm learning from them. And then we've got some that we need to continue to engage with. And those feel like longer discussions. And yeah, I think more work definitely has to be done on the environmental side overall to show the value and to bring that lower part of the distribution up to where everybody else is at.
Very good, thank you. Well, I think this is one of the questions we're going to ask our colleagues who are going to be presenting after you. But I wanted to ask you as well, what will the future automotive supply chain look like when it is sustainable?
So it's going to look very circular.
It's going to look what?
It's going to look very circular.
Okay.
And it's going to have recycled content from the vehicles themselves going back into create the new parts. It's going to have even more remanufacturing of goods because we know that if we can remanufacture something instead of just recycling it, that reduces energy consumption. It's going to be much more transparent because the nodes of the supply chain will be mapped, they'll be visible, there'll be greater disclosure. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm trying to, there are other pieces where there's going to be new technology. I think we have seen a real growth in technology in our logistics supply chains with the work being done on ships and locomotives and trucks. And in that way, they're lowering emissions in industries that have had all of the emissions in fuel. We're also seeing that in technologies around steel production. So I think high tech and automotive will start to blend together because we're going to need innovation to drive sustainability forward within automotive and the whole supply chain.
Very good. Thank you very much, Fred. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Well, we've heard from the futurist about where we thought we should be going in terms of sustainability. We've heard from the manufacturer about where they're heading, where they are right now, and where they're heading. And now we're going to hear more of a supplier perspective from our colleagues from Plant Moran. This will be a team effort. Dave Andrea and Lori Hoos will be presenting. Dave leads Plant Moran's Supplier Relations Analytics Group, which runs the industry's annual Customer Supplier Working Relations Index practice. He also provides our research and analysis related to mobility technology, market trends, supply base strategy development, and global trade and tariff planning for clients, including automotive manufacturers and suppliers. Dave has close to 40 years of experience in the automotive industry, working with a great many organizations. He helped found the Center for Automotive Research, served in many roles, including CFO, Director of Forecasting, Executive Vice President of Research. He's also a former Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the Original Equipment Suppliers Association, where he directed industry benchmark surveys, expanded OEM and media relations, and facilitated several OESA consoles. Dave earned his BS in business economics and corporate finance from Miami University and his MBA from the U of M. Lori Hoos has over 19 years experience and leads Plant Moran's environmental, social, and governance advisory practice. Her educational background includes an MBA in international business from Brandeis University and a minor in corporate environmental governance from Copenhagen Business School. She is a Fundamentals of Sustainability Accounting credential holder. Welcome. Dave, we're going to start off with you. You're going to start off first.
I will.
Okay.
Good. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you everyone virtually and everyone in the room here. We're doing this as a tag team because, as you heard from Bruce's introductions of us, I come from the really auto industry side and particularly the supply chain side. So what you heard from Stu and from Fred, we're going to continue it on into the supply chain. And I think everything is consistent from the standpoint that in our messaging that you'll certainly hear from Lori is everything we do, we have to think about this of driving it beyond just compliance and really getting this story of sustainability into the fabric of the companies here. This is just two.
Hold on for a second, Dave.
Yes.
I'm going to give you more sound.
Okay.
I think we need a little more volume. And we might need that.
Bruce and Dave, I'm still on. I can hear you fine.
Okay, you sound good over there too.
Great.
So I'm going to give a little more volume. Give Dave a little more volume here.
I need some bass. I'll bet.
Is it better now out in the back? You can't hear our voice? Is that any better? Is that better? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I'll
Back.
listen.
You're okay now.
Okay.
Let's share your screen. Let's do here. Let's do this. All right.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. So this is just one slide quick on Plant Moran to ground everybody on where we are coming from on this topic. Plant Moran is primarily a tax accounting and assurance firm, 100 years this year. we also have a wide range of management consulting practice areas as well. And the interesting in this area and overall sustainability and thinking about the implementation of the IRA funds and things like that, we really are working even more together across the firm and across each of these practice areas. So when we talk about the industry overall, and we really had a great setting of the stage, both by Stu and Fred here. There is a significant product transition. We know that that's going on here, and it's primarily in that vehicle powertrain area, but it really impacts all of the systems of the vehicle, particularly when you talk about value chain analysis and recyclability and the like. There, all systems are impacted here. But really, with the event of the drivetrains, electric drivetrains, and the batteries value chains here, the bill of material is significantly different in the industry that we have to start mapping to. And then that leads to production transition that's going on here now. And you can see all of those elements that we are involved with in this, looking at sustainability here. And this is one thing, and you all in the industry know this, but when we've gone through other product transitions, if you think about body on frame construction to unibody, or you think about front wheel or rear wheel drive to front wheel drive, and other catalytic converters and all the other types of transitions that have been major in the industry, we never had a complete overhaul, if you will, down through all the production transition and the supply chain. And that leads us into this industry sustainability that we're going to be talking with you about at the conclusion here of our seminar today, and really looking at it from the carbon reduction area, both in the product side as well as the production side, because again, as we come to this, it's not just about compliance, it really is about integrating that. So when we look at the hot topics for the auto suppliers here, and we're going to talk about ESG activities here, primarily focusing in on the environmental side, but they're all interwoven here. Without a doubt, it's about what does the customer want, as Fred talked through here. And there is a lot of skepticism in this as well, I will say, from the supply chain, in that we've seen these sometimes trends come and go, and regulatory issues and things like that. We don't think this is going away. So that's where it's that much more important, as Stu was talking about, really getting it integrated into your overall business. Looking at social, and we'll give a couple of examples here where I would never have thought in the auto industry we would be looking at some of these issues, but they're top and center. And then also on governance. And this is really looking at how do we put the practice areas in the largest vehicle manufacturers and first tier suppliers, but all the way through that second and third tier supplier and raw materials down through the chain that Fred talked about, that manages risk and manages costs. Okay, so in my practice area at Plant Moran, as Bruce mentioned, I run the Working Relations Index surveys. So these are in the public realm, 6 of the largest vehicle manufacturers with their logos on this slide here, provide us with their supplier lists for us, for Plant Moran, to survey on the working relations of between them, the vehicle manufacturers and the suppliers. What I did here was just pull 2 questions out of the 100 questions that we ask in the survey. And we asked on one, and this is a simple 5-point scale here, from 5 being the best. We asked OEM environmental objectives, are they well articulated enough to determine your firm's, the suppliers, your firm's investment strategy? And here, as these stack up, and they're very, very close. If you look at Toyota was at the top of the scale at 3.26. GM was second at 3.16 on that 5-point scale, and Honda had a 3.1. And then the second question we pulled out is the OEM provides your firm support to meet its environmental targets. A lot of the actions that Fred was talking about is behind, this question here of how do the suppliers perceive their customer supporting them? And again, these are all bunched up pretty close, with Toyota being on top at 2.67. You have Honda, then GM second and Honda third. And Fred, if you're still on and listening, I'll say we're in the field with this year's survey, and we blew these out to 6 or 7 specific ESG related questions. So we'll get an even better sense of what the suppliers think are going on in the world. But I want to point you to these key themes from the comments, and the comments on the right side, there are verbatims from the survey, but it really comes down to supplier cost of implementing these programs, the limitation of resources, particularly down through the smaller suppliers by size, but are still supporting the large vehicle manufacturers. Looking at the concern about the scorecard inclusion, meaning, are they going to get new business holds or have restrictions on their business because they're not environmentally compliant with new rules and regs? And this one, I'll say, is particularly difficult in the industry right now because purchasing is set up primarily to qualify on quality, delivery, service, and cost. And now the purchasing organizations are being given the responsibility now of tracking, as Fred had up on his slide, the M2030, EcoVitus, the CDPs, all these other types of tracking mechanisms. And then looking at the strategy articulation, how really well is this being implemented down through the supply chain and consistently through the supply chain? And then again, we're looking at these strategy changes as well. Okay, so this is our list. You saw, Stuart had his list of concepts in this ESG world. This is ours, and I don't care if you talk about it from a supplier sustainability commitment or other types of requirements that the vehicle manufacturers are pushing down on the first tiers and the like. When you go through those documents, these are the types of elements that are being required by the sub-tier suppliers, and signing up on terms and conditions just as much as they would have for any other type of business requirements. Now, as you look at this list, it too focuses in on the compliance side, emissions and air quality and energy management and things like that. And while Stuart kind of panned some of those things in terms of we got to get out of that lower quadrant, and I would never counter anything that Stu Hart would say, because I grew up across the street in my first job at the Transportation Research Institute. So he and Greg Keolian, as you mentioned earlier, those were two of my early heroes in my career. These are the things, though, that I say will pay the bills, though. And so while we can't pan those, it's those types of things in terms of reducing emissions and reducing energy and the like, those will pay for the types of movement into that upper quadrant, right? That he showed there. But we do have, when you look at the governance areas, thinking about product design and life cycle management and material sourcing and ethics and integrity, those are the broader, more complex issues that I think are on the suppliers' plates right now that really get it ingrained into the company strategy that makes long-term sustainability pay off. Okay, let me go through quickly 3 case studies that I just wanted to highlight of how complex the industry is becoming, even more so, I should say, from that side. Hyundai and Kia, all the headlines were there in terms of child labor being found in their supply chain. And this isn't in halfway across the world in some developing country. This is in the United States. And a lot of the issues were, founded from using third-party staffing agencies to fill these jobs. That's where we have to ask within your companies, how are you auditing those third-party staffing agencies that they're doing their job well to keep you out of these types of headlines? Here's Lear Corporation, of course, the large multi-system supplier for the industry, but in the interiors and with using leather for their seats, got the headlines for improper on animal rights and the like there, and have gotten letters from the Labor Bureau of International Labor Affairs and also from senators and the like, which are not, you don't want to be on that other side, of how do they do this? And this is down through their supply chain, but that's how, back to Fred's presentation on second and third tiers, we have to be very diligent in terms of how we're tracking these materials. And then finally, this is one with Rolls-Royce, and this is their supplier in their supplier code of conduct. So their suppliers are signing off on this. You have to read the fine print. It's not something to take lightly. And the one I'll point you to is down here in 2.3, along on climate action. And the phrase or the paragraph, we have committed to the use of science-based targets to assist and measure the reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, somebody in your company can sign off on that, but what does that really mean, science-based? And that's one of the things I think you heard in the earlier presentations of how we have to be more precise in how we are defining these elements and the like. And so with that, because I can talk about the industry level, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lori Hoos, who's going to get into the details on the emissions and sustainability. Lori.
Thank you, Dave. We have already heard quite a bit about the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So I'm actually just going to skip over this. The graphic here is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an organization I'll probably be mentioning again in our chat. They are pretty much the global standard when it comes to computing carbon emissions, carbon accounting. But going forward, I actually want to skip a slide here and just talk about stakeholders for a moment, because historically here in the US, this ESG, generally sustainability, more specifically, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, much more specifically, was something that large corporations, multinationals, publicly held companies we're thinking about, we're dealing with, we're responding to. But once you get further down, it was not really on the radar for many companies here for a very long time. And from a stakeholder perspective, there really was no real regulatory pressure to do anything with it. And so the companies here just kind of went about their business, going back to Dave's comments earlier about, is this real? Is this sticking around? Do we really have to do this? Other pressures were there, right? When we think about who the stakeholders are, there's some amount of staff or a retail customer, other peers, communities, et cetera. But it really wasn't, at least for us, until recently when the market started creating this pressure that we saw, and from Plant Moran's perspective, our client base is more of that middle market company. They generally weren't very interested. It just wasn't on their radar until their customers started asking and then requiring some amount of compliance information disclosure. And so all of a sudden, we started hearing about this a few years ago when we're getting calls from our clients saying, our customer just put us on hold. We can't bid on contracts anymore until we get our EcoVadis score up, until we get our CDP score up. What's going on here? We've had a D in CDP for years now, and it was fine. What's the problem? Now all of a sudden they're telling us we actually have to get our score up. So this pressure from the business community, from the market, really was what we saw starting to create that change with our clients. And so part of this is just thinking about expanding that lens on who you consider your stakeholders and who you're looking at and who you're listening to, really. So now with that, going back to the climate bill, this was brought up a couple times briefly, but this is really the first time that, again, this middle market, from what we're seeing, is starting to pay attention and say, oh, wait a minute, this is even bigger now. This is going to impact me. We had the SEC proposal out there floating around. It still is, but that's just public companies. To the extent that it included scope 3, it just didn't really hit the radar the way that this California bill is. And so we're absolutely seeing far more impact from this one than we have from regulatory compliance before. So Dave mentioned some of these platforms. I just want to set this stage for a moment because I think we'll be coming back to talking about these frameworks and standards. They are a little different. People typically talk about them together, and they are to some degree starting to consolidate and be rolled up. We are starting to see more of a global baseline when it comes to guidance around the disclosures. And this is more of that proactive, whether it's annual reporting, sustainability reports, whatever you want to call them. The International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, is what we're seeing much of the global legislation is based on. And so it has rolled up TCFD under it. It has included SASB as well. It is what the CSRD is based on. So there is, again, a lot of consolidation in this area, which is helping to create a little bit more consistency. But the distinction that we make here, especially when we're talking to those suppliers that, again, this just hasn't been on their radar, is that that's not what they're being asked to do. They're being asked, as we've talked about already, to fill out these surveys, these questionnaires, these rating platforms. Fred mentioned CDP, he mentioned EcoVadis, he mentioned M2030, Drive Sustainability is another one that's formed from a handful of OEMs, some of them more in the heavy duty space, but that's out of Europe. And one of the biggest challenges these suppliers are facing is the myriad number of these. And this is just a handful. They're getting ones that are specific to a product, a program, a industry, or a specialty, or what have you, from the markets even. So they are being asked to respond to half a dozen to a dozen of these different platforms. And I'll get back to that, but that's certainly one of the largest challenges for them. So I mentioned that we started hearing these concerns a few years ago. Our clients were saying, what are they doing? What are our customers doing? They all seem to be asking for something different. They're asking for it in different ways. What's going on here? Why can't they just pick one thing? And we said, well, we don't really know. Let us find out. So within Plant Moran, our cross-functional working group, if you will, as Dave mentioned, started doing outreach within our contacts to say, hey, what are your plans? And here's a handful of the folks that we talked to. A couple of you are either in the room virtually or physically, but we just really wanted to understand what's going on from your perspective, from your programs. And although you can see this is a very high summary, but there are slight nuances between exactly who they're targeting, exactly what platforms they're using, what combinations. But generally, the theme we found was very consistent, that all of them are looking to start collecting this data, as Fred walked through in more detail, looking for the transparency, starting small with a small ask of, hey, could you please just give us this information? Sometimes it was environment only, sometimes it was a broader scope. And some have moved forward to, all right, the ask is maybe not so polite anymore because now there's starting to be repercussions in some cases because it's being tied to scorecards or because contract availability is impacted. But generally, the roadmap is there, right? The roadmap is, it's not just disclosure for the sake of disclosure. And that is one thing that's really getting lost because the suppliers are telling us, we're spending so much time and energy right now just collecting, just providing the data. We don't actually have any time to do anything with the data. We're not able to make changes, to act on it. It's all just reporting out. And so that is just one of the challenges we're hearing. Here is just a list of some of the others, the clarity, the magnitude of the overlapping requirements. So again, similar data in all of them, but a different format. It's arranged differently. It's requiring rework to submit to each one. Stuart mentioned this idea of focusing on what's important to a business. We call that the materiality. It's different from a financial materiality, but what is material to your business? What is material to your stakeholders? So understanding that, figuring that out, that is a challenge, as well as the resources and staffing constraints. We don't have the people to dedicate to all of this, and they don't have the expertise. They don't have the environmental expertise specifically. There may be there from an HR perspective or from a regulatory compliance, health and safety, things that we're used to having to disclose on. But when we get into this environmental area, we don't know what our greenhouse gases are. We don't know how to calculate them. We don't know where to put them. We don't know what the data means once we have it. Is it good? Is it bad? They don't know. Then there's the upfront costs. Again, we've got budget constraints already. And where is it going to come from? Where does the budget come from to learn all of this and invest in the resources? Once we can do that, how is the data? Is the data a good quality? Is it available? Again, without knowing what it should look like, we don't really know how well the data is. We don't have the same controls around the data that we may in other areas. And then the last piece here is around this escalation of expectations. And Fred, I think, mentioned that this is an ongoing process. And what we need to be in order to be compliant today is evolving, and it's changing year after year. And so we're being asked more and more. So right when we think we're filling in the need and we're being responsive, the requirement changes. And so internally, we've developed this bit of a maturity model. I'll step through it quickly, but the idea is that we looked at about a dozen different dimensions or components of a program, from the governance and the oversight, the data I mentioned. I won't go into all of them. A lot of this are the challenges and pieces that we've already talked about, but where are our suppliers, or as an organization, where are you in this evolution of maturity, or as Dave said, getting beyond compliance? And, you can be in a different spot of maturity for each one of these. Many are still avoiding it. They're still just kind of keeping their head in the sand and hoping it goes away. Some are just being reactive to the specific requests. Give us this data. Okay, here is that data. compliance is a little bit more mature, all the way down to what we call optimization. It is embedded within your strategy. It is embedded within your governance. It's not something you're doing on the side or after the fact, but you're thinking about it along all aspects of these dimensions. And I was thinking as Fred was talking about, he was saying kind of his key areas are the disclosure and the due diligence. And if I go to this next slide, here's just kind of an example for each one of those dimensions. I know that's a lot of words on the page, but you will be getting these in handout. I really think of that idea that we're on top of our disclosures, we're doing the due diligence, we have some controls in place. To me, that gets you to efficient. But there's this next step as well of really optimizing the amount that we're embedding this sustainability thinking within just the course of all of the business. And so finally, this is just our recommendations to our clients to help them think about how to set up a sustainability program. Stuart mentioned in his matrix that many of the suppliers are already in that lower left quadrant. From a large tier one perspective, that is true, but from our clients, it's not. They are just barely struggling to get a toe in that quadrant. And so coming in and helping them figure out what data do they currently have, what do they need, how do they find it, and then finally they're working to embed that in and go beyond compliance. And so with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to Dave.
You're gonna turn it over and I'm gonna go back actually. Yeah, on this maturity models. So these are all the elements that generically at a top level, we've identified to be able to grade your supply chain down on how. The other one that I'll pull up here in terms of, we've talked a lot about the customer side and requirements here, but earlier when I mentioned that purchasing traditionally had sourced on quality, on cost, and on delivery, when on our accounting side are going through the statements, the forward projections of smaller suppliers, and there was always a risk, right, of your customer pulling a major program, putting a big hole in a revenue stream because of failure on cost, quality, and delivery. Now we're getting asked, well, wait a minute, you mean an OEM can put you on new business hold, or your customer, a first tier supplier, that might impact your sourcing, and that puts a revenue risk at risk, which from the accounting side puts a new level of scrutiny in terms of customer supplier relationships. And that's one that I want to put out there that we need to manage, because then the banks are going to be looking at that, as well as, well, you could pull the tools and lose money. This is another one where in a capital strapped industry, we can't have more obstacles in the way. But this is a simple way, an illustration of what we would say you can use inside your companies to go from this compliant phase, the left side of that maturity model, where you're developing your objectives, you're completing customer compliance, all of those types of things, to really, as Lori was talking about, making sustainability sustainable with your within your companies. And these are the optimized. These are really the left two columns of that maturity model. And that's delivering value to the business and achieving and maintaining customer sustainability compliance, but really making it cost neutral, or even at best cost positive, as Fred was talking about going into the suppliers to reduce their costs. I'll say, this is one where GM, and I would tell this to any of the OEMs, that they're going to be tested on trust. So is the OEM coming into your plant to really do a black belt event? Or is that going to come back to pricing and the other elephants that might be in the room there? And I say that particularly in the working relations index studies that I do, and I'll say this to any of the customers out there, if you're an OEM or if you're a large first tier and even a big second tier supplier, is trust is really going to matter in this whole thing. When Fred went down that list of, they have a pretty good idea, and those national surveys, pretty good idea on first tier because there's a tight working relationship there, but it falls off to second tier and to third tier. And just think about a customer coming into a supplier's plants and talking about sustainability. If there's not trust in terms of how that information is going to be used, the information is going to be hard to come by. It is. It's a matter, it's just human nature. I can guarantee it. In also summing up our presentation here and pulling some of the ideas that Lori talked about in terms of the harder core reporting pieces of it, this matches up. We didn't coordinate, but it matches up, I think, to kind of what Stuart was talking about. Yeah, there's the short-term types of issues about avoiding governmental fines or regulatory compliance and the like. And then there's longer term, if I go across that bottom axis, of the efficiency that Lori was talking about and minimizing compliance costs and the like. And then there's, how do you get this ingrained into the enterprise? So there's value to the program, a specific vehicle program, but then there's also value to the enterprise. And one thing to think about, and this may be too overly simplistic, so you all can come up with a better idea or a better example than what I'm going to give you, but just think back to when the first daylight safety headlamps came into requirements, and the daylight running lights. And the industry pushed back on that it was going to be too costly and it was going to disrupt programs and this, that, and the other. And they fought and fought and fought and fought about the daytime running lights. But when you go out of this meeting today, look at any vehicle front fascia of a car that's been built, certainly within the last 5 years, of how the industry has used daytime running lamps as styling cues. They're gorgeous. Actually, I get more distracted sometimes looking at these gorgeous styling cues. But my point is this: we took what was a standard, a requirement, a regulatory piece, just like, we're talking about here, and we turned it into a design competitive advantage. And you can look at the vehicles that do it right, and you can look at the ones that are still kind of hanging on. And I'll tell you, I think there's an idea in there of how we should advance this. So again, kind of it's a building on what Lori presented just earlier. It's in a different framework, but we think the steps are is looking at cost optimization. And I go back to what I was saying earlier, that these are the ways, this is the way to pay for the ongoing sustainability piece. And if we think of what Stuart mentioned, and I think it was in his Q&A, about getting all of the functions involved here, operations and HR and the like involved here, this is the way I think you get these programs paid for, function by function, plant by plant, program by program, and you build it up that way. Top line growth, again, I'll use my daytime running. Again, it's simplistic and it may not be the right analogy, but you can use a regulation for a design cue that would make your vehicles more attractive, that sell more vehicles, that then sell more parts for the suppliers. And that's what we're looking for here. And that's that brand differentiation, but it's also pricing premium. I don't know, when push comes to shove, will people pay more for a vehicle from an OEM that's a good social, good corporate citizen? But I can tell you that if it's not there, they won't buy it, right? The negative piece of that. And then finally, mitigating risk. And this is one that I think I would go back to, again, how important that first quadrant is that Stuart showed. Because when you're talking about risk, you're talking about your CFOs, because that's where all the corporate risk finally lands on his or her desk. And I go back to that issue about possible, well, Lori showed the one slide for possible fines. Right now, for a big vehicle manufacturer, I would say the headlines are worse for not complying than the $500,000. But for a small and medium-sized supplier, that's huge. And so this is one, in terms of, from the CFO, you can avoid that risk. And then, gosh darn, if you are avoiding risks, that should free up money to do these types of programs. And hopefully, as Lori showed earlier on some of these slides, get the right resources in place to be able to move beyond compliance. So here's our contact information.
A really good presentation, Dave and Lori. I really like the way that you were able to summarize a lot of things that we have already been talking about. In particular, the things that struck me was the opportunities for profitability. You know, it's one of the things in our title. It kind of takes sustainability out of just a reporting mechanism, as opposed to what can I do with this to differentiate myself from my other suppliers. And one of the questions I'll probably ask you guys is, can you see suppliers actually falling out because they will not be able to do this, not want to do it or not able to do it? And then their competitors ended up being taking over for them as a potential. So this idea of getting the profitability piece mixed in with the sustainability measurements, I think was a great addition. Fred, when you were listening to Dave and Lori tell their story, what was your takeaway from compared to the work that you guys are doing?
I think we're quite aligned. I talked to Dave and Lori throughout the year to conference and learn from them and to share what we're working on. The maturity curve that they presented, I think, was really relevant to what we see. The opportunity for suppliers to differentiate themselves through innovation and bringing that to GM, and more and more the innovation has sustainability built into it. That's also key. So I saw a lot of parallels to the work being done and the data that they shared. I also shared in my presentation this need for our suppliers to have efficient reporting so that then they can spend their efforts actually improving the situation. And Dave and Lori highlighted that as well. That's a common discussion point that we're having in the supply chain.
So when we look at the, a lot of the questions that we've been looking at during the conference, kind of actually, how far along are we in this development of sustainability metrics? And I thought Lori did a really nice job telling the story about the different kinds of metrics and the variety of metrics. And I guess when I'll start with you, but then I'll go to Dave and Lori. When do you see us this kind of coalescing about metrics? When do you think that will actually occur?
So I think the form of data collection or the process of collecting the data will commonize here soon within the next couple of years. I think those tools may have OEM nuances where, GM may have an extra question or two in this area and then another OEM would have a different question. But I think in terms of the ways and the tools in which suppliers will report, I see that really starting to commonize over the next year or two.
Dave or Lori, what do you guys think?
Yeah, so I would agree with Fred completely from the tools perspective. But I would say from the topics themselves, there's another term that we use around materiality that's dynamic materiality. And this idea is that the materiality changes very rapidly. It can change very rapidly. And so what topics that are material to an organization today or to stakeholders today may or may not be material tomorrow. And ones that are not even on the radar today may become very material tomorrow. And outside of any automotive example, the one I like to use is a global pandemic. How many organizations were ready and prepared to change their whole entire workforce to work from home over the course of a weekend? Some of them did it really well. Others struggled. But even the ones that did it well, probably because they had infrastructure in place, but it may not have been infrastructure in preparedness for a global pandemic. It was general infrastructure, work from home, remote, VPN access, etc. And so all of a sudden, this idea of this remote workforce became a very material topic for just about every organization practically overnight. And so the short and a little bit snarky answer, Bruce, to your question is never. Because there's always going to be new challenges coming up, and organizations have to have a framework in place to be able to respond to whatever it is. And so that idea of putting the framework, the governance process in place is super, super important so that you can be flexible to whatever the new materiality is.
Let me just jump back on that, Lori. Absolutely agree. And what's material for one organization, Lori talked about that changing over time. There are also material risks at an organization level, unique to their location, unique to their industry. And that's something that we see and talk a lot about as well.
Yeah, we missed the end of it. Fred, we got a little unstable internet connection here. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I agree completely with Lori on the dynamic nature of a materiality assessment. We also know that when suppliers are going through that maturity curve, conducting a materiality assessment is critical so that they understand what's material at their sites and in their organization. There are industry risks, there's location risks that will significantly change what's important to a supplier in a dry, arid environment versus one in a tropics. So not only will this materiality be changing over time, but there needs to be nuance to the site level needs.
Okay, thank you, Fred.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
Real quick? Sorry, and just one more piece is that is a large reason why it is very challenging to be able to consolidate to only one standard or reporting platform or survey questionnaire, if you will, because they all have a little bit different scope relevant to the topics that they are collecting up and reporting back on. And so what, again, going back to that materiality is going to differ. Organizations have different goals or focus on different things. And so the information they're looking from their supply chain varies.
Now, one of the other things that I talked about early in the conference was the SEC story, and the SEC is in the process of trying to require determining whether they would require a sustainability and ESG type of response in reporting for annual reports or maybe even quarterlies. So when you look at, and then I'm going to ask Dave on this, Fred, I don't know, you can jump in on this one or you can pass, but but I want Dave to see what he thinks, what his thoughts are about the possibility, and then if it becomes a law, a regulation, what effects this might have.
Thanks, Bruce, for putting me on the spot. I think it's going to be ultimately ruled out of scope for the SEC, and I also say that it's going to have multiple court battles and everything else too. From that standpoint, Lori had that logo up there about the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, right? Yeah. So I think it would be natural, or one step in between, that the SEC could require publicly traded companies to adhere to a standards board like that, but it wouldn't be their own sustainable standards, if that makes sense. That's what
So
Fred,
I
you can pass on that one if you want.
You know, I'll take it in a bit of a different direction, and I'll say that companies need to have controls in place so that when they do disclose information in the environmental space, that they're following very similar rules and internal processes that they do for their 10Ks and financial reporting. And in that way, if it's a regulation or not, that they have really great standards in place to make sure that they're reporting accurate information.
Sure.
And then I would just add one more element to that. My perspective is actually, it doesn't really matter what the SEC does, because if you take the United States out of the equation and just look at the rest of the world, they are all moving forward with regulations that are far larger in scope. The SEC proposal is only related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate risk. If you look at many other countries, they are adopting the ISSB standard, which is broader in scope. And so if you are a publicly traded company that only does business in the US, you may get a break if the SEC proposal doesn't go through, or if it does and it has legal challenges, or if the California one that now has legal challenges ends up being overridden. But chances are your business is going to cross those types of boundaries, and you're going to be subjected to any number of regulations in any number of countries. And so I would argue that from a business resiliency perspective, going back to some of those different ESG topics that Dave showed, there are a lot of other reasons and a lot of other stakeholders to think about to give you motivation to move forward with it, regardless of what the SEC does.
Very good, thank you. Now, one of the issues that Dave and Lori talked about was the focus on how do you make this profitable? How do you get these things to pay for themselves? and Dave did a nice job of telling the story about this. One of the things that reminded me of this, one of the slides that I was talking about earlier was the signaling, and that if you signal that you're a good corporate citizen, that if you signal that you are interested, and this signal gets sent not just to the companies, but to the consumers and customers, the end users, that it could have an effect on your company. Indirectly if you're a supplier, directly if you're a manufacturer. Of course, Tesla is an example of this, and General Motors coming out saying we're going to do all EVs. We are going to be this type of company. Tesla saying we are this type of company, and I think it was successful in terms of getting people to believe that your company is a particular type of company, and that it's signaling things that consumers would say, yeah, this is the type of company I want to drive one of their vehicles. And I think that this is, it applies to all the manufacturers that are making EVs, but I thought that was an interesting, another piece of the puzzle in terms of how do you make this more profitable for your company. Fred, do you agree with that?
If I followed right, Bruce, I would say that there's definitely revenue opportunity in having more sustainable products.
Yeah.
There's also cost-cutting paths in the supply chain in one zone operation where you're reducing the energy that you use through efficiencies while you're also saving money. So I see opportunities on both ends of that equation.
Dave?
So I think I would agree with Fred that there's definitely some market out there for sure. And especially as we see the younger generations, we see it from a campus recruiting perspective, that this younger generation wants to work for companies whose values mirror their own. They want to purchase products whose companies values mirror their own. So to a small degree on the margins, I would say sure, but I don't think that is the larger motivation, if you will, that would be driving these decisions. I think, again, going back to those stakeholders, there are enough other stakeholder groups that have either bigger carrots or bigger sticks, that is really in and of itself enough. I think that the companies that want to that have aligned themselves with a certain messaging or a certain branding, they've done that and they want to, and that's great. And I certainly champion that. But there's much more opportunity out there for others, and that's not what we're seeing drive the decisions and the newer entrants in that space.
There's also this, back to your point, Lori, there's this risk mitigation piece that companies will pay to reduce risk in their operations and supply chains. I also do, and we'll politely agree to disagree. I want to chat about it sometime, Lori. If we think about the Patagonia model, for instance, they're definitely capturing revenue through their sustainability messaging. It isn't widespread yet for many name brands, but there are proof points. So let's chat later.
Very good, thank you. Last question, and Dave and Lori, we asked you, Fred, we asked this question for you, so we'll give them a chance. What will the future automotive supply chain look like when it is sustainable?
Okay. All right. I would say that if you go down the list of the attributes, the characteristics that Fred ran through, I would agree 100%. I guess what I would add to that is I think it's going to be even a much smaller supply base. which is good and bad, from the standpoint of depending upon fewer number of suppliers, whether that's from a price discipline standpoint or a supply chain resiliency standpoint. But it just seems like to do business in automotive is going to take such a higher level of capital, of human resources, and specialties that I just see that being constrained or constricted even more. And that's the one that goes back, I think, Bruce, on your question earlier about for sustainability, will there be purchasing decisions that put one supplier in a competitive advantage over another supplier? Fred alluded to it, in terms of paying a premium for sustainability. In our maturity model, ultimately it becomes it becomes cost neutral, which will be interesting because that's one question we have in our survey this year. But I asked of one heavy duty over the road truck manufacturer, because they were saying the same things up on stage about sustainability and their supply base and the like. And in a sidebar, I asked them, can you give me an example? And he said, I won't give you the example, but I can tell you twice within the last year sourcing new programs. So it's two. I mean, it's not huge, that they did pay a premium for a lower carbon footprint from the supplier, versus another supplier with a lower price but a higher carbon footprint. So it's starting. How's that?
Very good. Thanks, David. I think that's where we're going to end it. I want to thank everyone for participating, the people online, the people here at the U of M North Campus Research Complex. I want to thank our speakers for great presentations, good discussion about topics. I think we really hit a lot of the main points. As usual, thanking our affiliates for the support. We couldn't put our conferences on without them. Next conference is in April. Kind of looking at what the risk issues related to deglobalization, nearshoring, onshoring. Again, another supply chain questions. And the presentations and the video will be available by this weekend. Thanks again for everybody. We'll see you next time.